Alrighty. Good morning, everyone. I think we might have got a nice quorum there, so we might get started. I wanted to first start just by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country which I'm coming to you from, which is the Ngunnawal country. I was out in the bush this morning, just connecting with the country and getting some positive vibes for this morning's session. So really looking forward to it. So I want to acknowledge our traditional owners, past, present, and emerging. So. Um, Very excited to be kicking off today. This has been in the works for a little while. This little presentation, and yeah, really excited to be bringing a couple of excellent presenters with a great topic to everyone. So, with that, I want to introduce everyone to Dave Waxman from Microsoft, and Dave is the worldwide director of industry accelerators, and it's quite a cool role that he has. So I'll throw over to Dave to do a quick introduction about himself.
Sure. So good morning. Thanks, everybody. Yes, as Andrew said, the director of worldwide accelerators for Microsoft. Essentially, what we do is we select a number of industry use cases, and we try to basically put some basically time and techniques into actually making this available to you. And I'll take you through one of those today. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Then I'd also like to introduce Dr. Kelvin Ross, who's the co-founder or the founder of KJR and our resident machine learning and AI expert. So I'll throw over to Kelvin for a brief intro.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, it's certainly testing and evaluations close to my heart over 30 plus years. But yeah, the last 10 years we've had a lot of experience with machine learning, and today I think what's really a changing space is the large language models and retrieval augmented generation and the information assistant specifically. So I'm excited to chat about that today.
Excellent. Alrighty, so go on one slide. So done the intros. Our agenda, just some logistics. I popped a note in the Q&A section there before. So if you've got any questions while we're going through, just pop it in there, and I'll keep an eye out and interject with the team as they're going through. So we're going to have Dave give us an overview of the information assistant, which is the particular accelerator that we've been working with recently. And then after that, Kelvin's going to give a bit of brief run through about how we've actually approached the testing of it, and actually just building trust. So it's far more detailed than testing. And then we'll have a bit of Q&A with both Kelvin and Dave. And yeah, if there's some questions on the way through, happy to ask, and we'll try and keep it as interactive as possible because this is all about information sharing. So with that, I'll pass over to Dave and let you go through.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So yeah, again, today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about one of the industry accelerators known as the information assistant. But before I do that, I just want to explain the concept of the industry accelerator. Next slide. So an industry accelerator from Microsoft might be a relatively new concept to many. The idea is that we know that it takes quite a bit of time, expertise, and money to essentially work through creating value from many of the services on Azure and Microsoft. And generally people don't have a lot of data scientists and developers just sitting around waiting to do something. And so what we saw was, why don't we select a number of different industry use cases? And then what we're going to do from Microsoft is we're going to assemble many of those components together. We're going to assemble them together. We're going to write the code. We're going to provide a user interface, provide an output, provide scripting, even provide documentation, and even education to go with it. And then the idea is what we're going to do is we're going to package all of that up. And then we're going to provide that at no charge to both customers as well as to partners to just really accelerate that time to value, essentially on that journey in AI. And so the key here is it's not a product. It's not for sale. The idea is if you want access to it, I'll provide the link into the chat later. But the idea is that while what I'm going to show you might look like a demonstration you typically see from Microsoft, the difference is you can take this one home. You can integrate it. You can customize it. You can take it apart. You can monetize it. All we've done is just try to speed that process along. And that's really where the goal here of an industry accelerator is. Okay, next. So in all of my work with the public sector, generally we've seen that when I work with public sector customers, a lot of times they're going to have a lot of concerns. They see ChatGPT, Llama, a lot of things happening in the news, and for a lot of reasons they're a little reticent to start using these things. One of those reasons might be the fact that these models are dated. Once GPT 3.5 or 4 is essentially launched, that's it. It's never going to learn anything more. They're trained on public data sets, which means they can answer very good questions about public information, but about your own private data, they really have no knowledge. Fabrications and or hallucinations. They have an ability to essentially create quite realistic sounding responses, which may not be based on anything. That problem is really magnified by the fact that they don't really provide any citations or references for how and where they actually sourced the information to generate that response. And then finally, the lack of clarity on any real thought process. How did I get here? Walk me through your thinking. And so for that reason, a lot of my public sector customers have really had some reticence in adopting these in a real useful pattern in business. Next, please. And so for those reasons, we've created something known as the information assistant. The goal here is really quite simple. It's really to allow you to have a conversation with your private or domain-specific data. But when you have that conversation, you should make sure that your response is current, so that if information's arrived in the last hour, you can tap into it. Relevant in that it really is going to base its response exclusively on your private or domain-specific data. Controlled in that you should be able to adjust that response type from either precise to creative, for example. Referenced in that when it responds, it must provide you a reference or citation to where it sourced the information to generate that response. Personalized in that it must really respond with the user's persona or role in mind. We'll see a little bit of that in that live demonstration. And then finally, explainable, so that we can understand that thought process that was used. So we go next. So instead of having me talk some more about it, why don't we have a bit of a look? So if it's okay, I was going to share my screen.
Yep.
All right. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. All right. So when we provide access to the information assistant, again, we'll be providing it through a public GitHub. You'll be getting access to all of the code. It'll be provided through a scripting language, in this case, Bicep and or Terraform. And the idea here is that what you do is you fill in a few variables, you click Make Deploy, and within 35 minutes, you're going to have what I show you up and running within your tenant. And so it's going to save you a few hundred, maybe even thousands of person hours to get to this point to create this retrieval augmented generation pattern. And the idea is that if you can spin this up quickly, you can very quickly do some kind of a proof of concept or pilot. Because it's one thing to have access to OpenAI, it's another to really orchestrate all of those components together. So the goal is that the IT team will spin up an instance, as you see here. Once you spin up the instance, the key is that, well, who's going to use it? Well, that would be the non-technical folks. That could be the teachers, the lawyers, the analysts, the people who want to be able to load some data and ask some questions. So we've tried to make this a relatively easy process. So we've gone in and we've created something called a managed content function. With the managed content function, as long as you have the technical chops to drag and drop, you can drag and drop anything that you want in there, right? So someone just emailed you something, you want to ask some questions about it. Someone's got some stuff on their network drive, they want to drag this in. The tax law for 2021, 500 pages. I don't want to read the whole thing, I just want to ask questions of it. Drag and drop. Furthermore, we also give you the ability to provide only a subset of the data. Now, why is this important? Some of our first customers turned out to be tax organizations. They wanted to ask questions about tax law, but sometimes they want to ask it just about 2020's tax law because that's when that was filed, even though it's 2022 or 23. And so we've given them the ability to either drop their information into an existing folder or create a new folder. And this allows them to put their information into particular folders. So when they ask a question, they can limit their response to only a subset of the data. Something you're not going to find in most of the other RAG implementations is that ability to not search just everything, but limit the scope of that. So the folders are one way to sort of vertically separate your data. We also give you tags. This was created in a justice context. We had hundreds of documents related to an individual case. We put them into a folder, but Dave Waxman's the lawyer in 3 different cases. So we've got an ability to search and segregate that data both horizontally and vertically. Once you've dragged and dropped it, then you're off to the races. So what we want to do now is have a conversation with our data, but we want to be able to personalize that experience. We want to give you that ability to make sure that if I was to ask a question, and let's say it was a question about mitosis, if I was to write down that I'm a biology professor, then I expect it's going to speak to me in a certain tone, certain vocabulary. If I'm to write down I'm a second grader with an interest in science, it should be responding to me differently. So that ability to change that user persona allows you to personalize that experience. The system persona is the one doing the talking. This is the one that's like, how are you going to speak to me? And again, these are not drop downs. They are descriptive fields that you can put in whatever you like. The response length. Am I looking for something that is succinct? I'm trying to prepare an answer for a CEO. Or thorough. I'm looking to prepare a new law or policy. I'm looking for much longer types or more detailed responses. The conversation type. Am I looking for precision? How much money do I have in the bank? Am I looking for creativity? With this new law, what are some ways people might try to get around it? So the key is that all of these really are controls. And then finally, your ability to then limit that subset to one, all, or just multiple selected ones as you see fit is that ability to then be able to ask those questions, limit the scope of the response so that when you ask a question, if I was to ask a question here, what are Microsoft's primary sources of revenue? I wanted to ask a question, but limited to only my own private data. It generates a response, but most importantly, you're going to see for portions of the response, you're going to see those numbers which correlate to the citations. And these citations then let me check to see where did this information come from. This is sort of the beginning of trust. I can't just believe the machine just because it says something to me. First, I'm going to get that it's going to say, well, it came from this portion of the response, came from this citation, and it came from this document chunk. And that's very important because sometimes it's going to be coming from a much larger document. So if I was to take a look at the original in context, it's actually coming from page 31 of 65. And so when it can actually take me to the section of the document, I can then begin to start to have some level of trust in the system because now I'm able to check it. If I was to say, Wax, it's coming from the 2021 tax law, it's a 750-page tome, you're going to be like, well, I'm not going to check it. And if I can't check it, I can't believe it. And so again, this is really just a quick primer. This is actually giving you a preview of the 1.1 capability. This should be announced probably about the next 48 hours or so. You'll find quite a few brand new features in this one, including the ability to then compare your results with not only asking a question of your private data, but then compare that with the internet. Not only get an internet response, tell me how they're the same and how they're different, as well as a fully ungrounded response. If sometimes you just want to ask a question of the model, but you don't want to be basing it on any documents, you want to ask a question, but in that more secure environment. In addition, something you won't see on the features is we're going to have a secure deployment option. So one of the very frequent and common questions is, I can deploy this, but now I have to go through the private endpoints and the encryption and all of that. We're going, well, we're going to give that to you as an option as part of this latest deployment. And then you'll also be able to see something called agents. We've got 2 new agents. One is a math assistant, which not only will help you answer math questions, because large language models don't actually do math, as well as the ability to have a conversation with your, in this case, structured data. Not something you can do today, right? Just maybe drop in a spreadsheet and ask a question in natural language. So again, today, I just wanted to kind of give you just a quick preview. And what I'm going to do is just say thank you, and I'll answer questions in the chat. And I will turn it back to you, Andrew. And Kelvin, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. There's some very, very cool features coming through there. So I'll take control and share the deck, and we'll step through, again, sort of building on how to build trust, and dive into how we've approached it in our instance. I think there was one last slide there. So that was what you just covered in the in your chat. So we'll go to the next one, and we'll throw over to Kelvin.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks, Andrew. So I'm here to talk a bit more about the testing and evaluation side. David talked a lot about trust, and certainly for us and our clients, that's a key consideration. Also, for us, it's about how do we not only develop approaches for our customers about how to utilize these extremely powerful tools, but also what are the internal uses ourselves inside the company. So we're finding the information assistant a very powerful tool for, a portal for helping our sales team prepare bids on private information, for our HR team and our employees to look up policy. And even I'll talk a bit more about our sort of work on validation-driven machine learning, a methodology we've been sort of sharing with our customers about what we've learned, and having effectively a chat tutor that can go through that information and extract it out. So it's not just how we test and evaluate these things, but how we actually use these tools internally and how our customers then go on to use it as well. So maybe the next slide. So for us, as I mentioned, we've been involved in machine learning for many years now, well over a decade, starting out with things like recommender engines and then on to more traditional machine learning as deep learning sort of got more powerful. Started off with structural sort of predictive models, and then moving a lot more into deep learning with computer vision and ultimately large language models. In the large language models area, we've seen a rapid acceleration, certainly within the last 2 years since OpenAI released ChatGPT. But there was actually a lot going on prior to that with the introduction of like transformer architectures and so on. So we'd actually been working with other large language models such as BERT and FLAIR, and then ultimately a bit more work in Bloom. Applying that in, we've been doing a bunch of projects in the medical domain, and they're very powerful tools for actually understanding text and content and deriving information from that. So traditionally we would build classification models, name entity recognition, sort of deriving information from text documents and sort of adding that into information corpus. And even down to, we found that these large language models became the most powerful state-of-the-art methods for de-identifying documents. So actually marking up documents with large language models to remove names and addresses and other private information. We found them very powerful in those areas. But that sort of, even though we're using large language models, it was still very much traditional machine learning, where we were building a training set, validation set, and going through really that functional sort of evaluation. Next slide. But really, it's ChatGPT started off that really that use of the chat interface, that question answering interface, that also led to a lot of power and how we can use that to actually assist. So really, most organisations, text and documents are the cornerstone of their organisation. So whether that's in government or industry or business, we are so driven by documents and text. So the ability to build a question answering system, but then to use that concept to look at translation, code generation, summarization. But equally, what we found is that chat interface then enables you to build what's sort of called zero or few shot classifiers for undertaking some of those other tasks that we're using machine learning for in a more traditional approach of building up training sets and validation sets. So very rapidly now, we have this very powerful tool with zero examples or few examples in the definition of the prompt, can perform classification extraction tasks on documents for information retrieval at very high levels of accuracy. But the question is how trusted can we be? How effectively is that working, as David pointed out? Maybe over the next slide. And so certainly the adoption of those tools within industry and certainly within government saw a lot of conversation about policy. And certainly with the information assistant, what it's addressing is the concept of your own local large language model that is working on your own documents in your own environment. A lot of those concerns about security, about whether I'm training a model that goes back to Microsoft and things like that are isolated away by design, because it's now in your environment. We have a lot more security control and so on that environment. So a lot of those sort of issues that we have and concerns about, we don't want to work with external APIs unless we really have complete control over that information leakage, is more or less designed by incorporating these models on premises or within our own private cloud, as David pointed out. But we see many of these concerns that we talked about be expressed in government policy, for instance. So there's been a big rash of policy documents that have emerged from government in the last 6 months or so. And many of them started off with the information security element, quite rightly. But equally, they talked about accuracy, bias, ethics, transparency, accountability, and so on, other attributes. And these are all very important elements, but we typically find people are very confused about these policies and principles, and how do we actually get to the point of implementing those in our implementation. So what are those elements that we have to take on board? So I mentioned in addressing some of these concerns, if we break them down, things like privacy and security, we can address some of those concerns by design of the system, by how we isolate data, potentially even if those concerns are further escalated about our, let's say we design a systems only for internal use. That controls the security of the responses as well. But if perhaps the responses are available to others outside of the organization, we might also want to add other further controls around the information security where they can access that endpoint. And that might include also going further to de-identify some of the documents that we've actually got in the context. So these are elements that we think about the design and implementation of the system and how we design some of those controls in place. How do we factor in human in the loop and so on? The other elements are then about, well, what are those evaluations that we perform? Because for many aspects, these very powerful tools, they work quite well out of the box, but we're always uncertain about to what level of performance do they perform, and how do they perform in these different stratifications or corner cases, or do we reveal bias? And the only way that we really can get a grasp on that is by undertaking further evaluation. So I'll talk a bit more about that focus for us has been our evaluation techniques. So next slide, thanks. As I mentioned, for quite some time now, we've been collating our experiences over the last 10 or 12 years in machine learning, and sort of common threads that we're picking up in how we build machine learning models and then validate them. And that's sort of encapsulated in our methodology that we call VDML, and I'm quite happy to share more information on our learnings in that area. But the key concept of VDML is we sit within a context of understanding the problem space. So we first of all define how we're going to use a particular product like an information assistant. What task will we apply it for? What context will it sit within? Is it sitting within human in the loop, internal use only? And from that, we can assess the risk of those areas, and that might make us rechange the implementation and more closely define. Once we've sort of settled on how we're going to use the system and apply it and implement it, we then go into this phase of really it's an iterative process of validation first, followed by optimization. The validation actually leads to the optimization, and all of this is very data centric. It all relates around the data domain that we're talking about. And in our cases, we're sort of narrowing it down to very specific corporate information on narrow problems. And then ultimately, we come at the end after we're now happy with the integration of the model that we have. We need to think about the context of how that sits within the organization, what other apps and interfaces it might connect to, and how it's integrated, and then that concept of how do we continue to monitor that through its life cycle, because one of the key issues is data does change. We might update new documents to the context, or the way we interact with our clients changes over time. David gave a good example of, new legislation might come out each year and so on. But pretty much across machine learning, we find this common thread of validation first, which clearly identifies what your optimization routes are. So next slide. So with the information assistant, what we're really talking about is a large language model that's deployed on premise, that is narrowed down to a particular context of documents. So this is called retrieval augmented generation. If we think about this process, what the large language model is doing is, first, when we ask a question, it's first defining what document sections or components are relevant to the question we're answering. First, combine all of those up and assemble them as part of the context, and then get the large language model to synthesize an answer from the context that we retrieved that was relevant to our question. So we start off with a prompt, it retrieves relevant sections, and then the synthesis can work out whether those sections are actually relevant to curating the answer or not. And then, as you saw David's demonstration, we end up with an answer with citations referring to the relevant sections that were output. Next slide. So our initial approach to that is okay, we can stand up an environment, but the validation first thing is going, this is a very powerful environment. How do we go about this? And for most people, they would build an environment and start running prompts and queries in very much an ad hoc way. But to really scale this up, we need to actually consider how those responses vary in different situations with different kinds of queries and so on. And very quickly, it lends itself to an automated approach of actually scaling it to different scenarios. And as we introduce more and more automation, we can actually use large language models for helping us do that evaluation. We can use large language models for helping us to generate data. But pretty much we then have a framework that when we identify gaps or discrepancies and how we might optimize and improve that model, very quickly we can iterate through that phase. But as I said, most large language models lend themselves to this few-shot, zero-shot learning. So out of the box, they tend to work quite well. But the validation actually gives us a benchmark of actually how they're performing on a broader concept or that broader domain that you're going to deal with data. We can go beyond that and sort of also start looking at tracking all user queries or going out and performing more detailed human evaluation. But these are typically more expensive tasks to scale, but definitely the automated evaluation area. So for us, working with Information Assistant, what we've really been focusing on is what are those available frameworks that we can use, given other test automation work that we've done for decades. What's specific about large language models? And for that, it's more about how do we prepare input prompts and how do we actually evaluate responses to scenarios. And so I've popped down a few tools that we've been working with and evaluating. The tools are all slightly different. They have their different strengths and weaknesses, but these are definitely excellent starting points for how you might work with these frameworks. So you've got Pirate, TrueLens, and Langsmith. But I won't go into a lot of detail on those tools in this presentation, but I can certainly, we can follow up if you want more information in that area later. Next slide. But pretty much for most of our work that we've been doing elsewhere in machine learning, a lot more of the evaluation has oftentimes been a lot more functional. So for instance, the example we gave around like de-identifying medical notes or even the classification work, we typically have an expected result that's very precise. With generative AI, what we're finding is the result tends to be somewhat slightly different to what we might anticipate. So we might have an expected result, but it's very difficult to just fall back to traditional approaches to say, does the actual response meet the expected response? So if I ask our information assistant chat about our policy, about a question like how much annual leave do I accrue working at KJR? I'm expecting a result to say I would receive 4 weeks annual leave a year. As you can see here, the request that comes back has a lot more detail. So as an evaluator and building up an automation framework, we need to start thinking about these considerations. Is this a correct result when we're anticipating this 4 weeks a year? So there's other information in there, and then we need to start considering, just beyond whether this is a similar enough answer to be considered correct, we might also need to understand or rank, how understandable is the text? Is it aligned with the level of the audience that I'm dealing with? Is it safe? Is it not having some unusual responses in there? And what's starting to emerge is different approaches that we might take to that. So pretty much exact matching and similarity tools, sort of the old style approaches, are not really coping with that style of evaluation. So there's a lot of work in this model-based approaches to test automation. And actually, a lot of that work is using large language models to do things like look for similarities, but potentially also rank or score the quality of the content. And so again, there's many tools and frameworks that are emerging in that space. So a lot of those tools I talked about earlier have some out-of-the-box components of those LLM evaluators, but also that ability to start building and plugging in things that are sort of use case specific to your scenario. Beyond that, as I said, that phase of automation, I think, is the bedrock of you being able to build and iterate on an application. Beyond that, as you emerge into more higher integrity scenarios, then you're going to have to look at some more expensive techniques, but ones that are actually incorporating more human judgment, because the LLMs using other LLMs as evaluators are relatively good, but then there still are issues around is it just fine tuning some of that context. Next slide. And then dealing with RAGs in particular, it's not only the end response that we want to look at, it's actually trying to break down the other components along the way. So context is super important here. So one of the things that we want to do, if we are asking particular relevance, for instance, about our HR policy, we want to know that it's specific to our HR policy, that it's pulled out the relevant citation. So has it been complete in terms of its recall on extracting out relevant sections to build up the response, and ensuring that it hasn't necessarily looked out elsewhere and gone and retrieved the leave policy from the US Department of Trade or something that might have been in the original language corpus or something like that. So while much of our testing sort of focuses on that last bit, that answer relevance, working with RAGs and the information assistant, we also want to closely look at that context as well to ensure that things are contained in that space. So yeah, is the context extracted relevant? And then our response, was it actually grounded on those responses that came back? And sometimes when we look at these attributes, you want to lift up the hood of the information assistant or other sort of chat architectures that you built to actually look at those intermediate responses that have come back. As you saw with David, we can see the citations at the end, which are the ones that are agreed on were most relevant to the answer. But what's also useful is actually understanding what were the complete set of citations that we initially filtered down to, and was that a correct list? So a bit if you're used to traditional testing, rather than looking at our sort of acceptance test or our system test at the end, we might want to do some deeper integration testing in the individual steps along the process. Next slide. And then ultimately, everything we talk about in BDML is this validation first concept, is then it becomes clearer on perhaps where some of the limitations of the model we're working on and what those options are for optimization. So there are many routes for optimization. So if it doesn't work first out of the box, there are many mechanisms to tune and optimize the performance. And I think for people undertaking POCs, and they might not get the response they want initially, it's sort of realizing to them that there are options to actually tune and refine this behavior. So a lot of that might start out with prompt engineering, curating the context, curating what the the sort of some examples and things like that in the context of the answer you want and so on. And you can use that to take things a long way, particularly if you're doing classification tasks or other information extraction tasks. You can go along the path of further refining your content retrieval and not just adding more content and things like that, but actually fine-tuning how content's sort of extracted from the filter and sort of go that route. And then also there's the route of actually fine-tune training the model so it more understands the language and the sort of corpus that typically you're dealing with in your narrow use case. And then combinations of all those above to really exceed performance. Next slide. And then the last point, remember I said that at the top we would sort of define the tasks, we would sort of assess the risk and maybe iterate a bit there before we fall into a sort of a chosen design approach, and then we evaluate and then tune and optimize in that process. Once we're ready with an application, we would then think about the context that how are we going to integrate that into the application, and then ultimately how are we going to monitor for drift or change in sort of data that's being used or queries being used and so on. And again, here evaluation may plug into many components. So we may actually add more guardrails before and after the LLM, for instance, to do pre-processing where we can actually run tests on whether these kinds of queries being pushed through to the LLM are in fact acceptable and within the scope of what we'd like to include. Or afterwards, we can sort of look at the results coming back and do further evaluation and truth checking. And these methods have been found to again further improve the performance of the system. So again, that sort of testing component doesn't just stop with the sort of LLM agent in the middle. Next slide. So I've talked a bit about different techniques. And like as David's chatting about is, well, where might you start with the information assistant? And certainly having worked in medicine for a long time, I see a lot of exciting stuff happening in medicine, but probably the last place I'd apply machine learning to at the moment is actually that bit that everybody wants to do, detecting a disease and things like that. Because I think there's actually a lot of low-hanging fruit that's high value, that there's not so many risk barriers in our way to see progress. And by not having so many of those barriers just really preventing us moving forward or people being unsure about which way to go so we can't get approval for taking the next step, we're better off to select still a high value business case, but one that perhaps is in a less risky area. So in a medical space, oftentimes that might be things like extracting out our billing information and things like that from medical records. Coding in terms of getting reimbursements is a really big, costly problem with hundreds of people employed to do that manually. And they're often the low-hanging fruit because you're not impacting the patient, you're not going to be using that data to send out information or look at what drugs they're being used and things like that. But it's still an extremely high-valued task. The other thing is where we can remove away really quite private data. So again, even in that context, could we de-identify the data or just deal with public information to begin with? So a classic example is the New South Wales government looked at their government gazettes because that's public information anyhow, and therefore, the risk of information leakage and so on is really reduced in that situation. I'd certainly recommend as well that you limit to that internal use initially and really have that human in the loop element sort of designed in, so you really understand how this system's performing. You've got better control over the user base and the exposure, and then really design that human in the loop component into the initial trials. Doing a POC, I would definitely move towards building some level of automated evaluations, because I think what's critical is people just get these ad hoc evaluations, and if it doesn't look good, the project doesn't move forward at all because they don't bother tuning. But also just the naive of few examples, you might be it's just not it's a too shallow an evaluation, and things need to be looking a bit more in different stratifications and corner cases, and then look at how you would build that ongoing monitoring and implementation. So really, this first POC for you is really about building that internal understanding capability to deploy these models and really build up trust within the organization. As I said, we find the models extremely powerful. They are definitely going to be a massive game changer for our industry. And it's more about what guardrails, what safety components, what evaluations we put on top of that to move forward. So hopefully I haven't gone too much longer, Drew, and I think that's my last slide.
Yeah, it is exactly right. And over into Q&A. And so there's a couple of questions have popped up, and actually quite a nice segue from your comments just there. The first one's from Brett, posted towards Dave, but both for yourself as well, Kelvin, as to what kind of POC would be good for the information assistant or any other LLM solution. So do you have any feedback from the people we've been working with collectively to date as to where we've seen success in POCs and where we've seen not so successful POCs?
Sure. So it turned out our very first 5 customers were all actually tax agencies. Tax law is long, it's complicated, it changes every year. It was very difficult to keep up with. And it all turned out to be also in foreign language, which actually introduced some new challenges for us. So the idea of, as Kelvin mentioned, an internal use case. So this was really originally designed for the internal help desks at all of these tax agencies to be able to answer questions about tax law, tax process, et cetera. Since then, the idea of a government contact center. So again, public information, how do I register for a fishing license, et cetera, all of that information, that was also been a very big deployment. And actually, as it turns out, education was actually quite surprising, for at least for me, because I don't have a background in education, but it seems to have landed quite well in that ability to provide assistance for students and the things that they're looking for, assistance for administrators and parents, the things that they're looking for, and assistance for the teachers. 3 different deployments with 3 different goals. But I think most of them followed many of the things that Kelvin talked about. None of them really dealt with personal information. Generally started with mostly public and or low risk information, but was quite painful in that trying to understand large volumes of information in the case of tax. Education, you couldn't really provide people that level of dedicated knowledge. And you know what? Create me a pop quiz on physics on the properties of light. Give me 5 more questions. And so they get dedicated attention in a way that they couldn't from a teacher because there's just not enough time in the day. So each one of those was really satisfying a different niche, but they followed many of the same patterns that Kelvin mentioned. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's really, really cool. And so there's a question here from G in terms of following that thread, coincidentally, around PII. And I think she mentioned in one of Kelvin's slides, we had the removal of PII as a pre-processing task. Do you think that would need to be a post-processing task as well? So I guess it's dependent on what data you have, but what are your thoughts on, where to put the guardrails, I suppose, is probably the ultimate question.
Kelvin, did you want to take that one? Because that sounded like that was right on your alley.
Yeah. And look, it's a tricky one to answer, but it is definitely something I would be adding is validation of no private information being disclosed. It's just adding more security controls really around the fringe of the product. Like I said, now we've found detecting PII infringements works quite well using language models to do that detection, looking for potential releases. There's definitely, though, certain attacks that we need to always be aware of. Security is a sort of a complex threat environment. We need to keep up to date with research and sort of moving sort of threat vectors that are emerging. I think what I find really perplexing in industry is how often security breaches are due to poor housekeeping, and more because we're just really letting PII information sort of float around in areas that we shouldn't let it float around in. So more having a process of, removing PII from information that might get moved over to a repository, but as you said, looking for PII leakage coming out the other side as well, and certainly also screening for PII input into the prompt as well. We really don't want people, adding in their private information, whether it's a credit card number or something like that at the front end either. We prefer not to know that sort of information, and so that way we don't want it showing up in our logs or our repositories uncontrolled.
Yeah, very cool. It's another question from Brett, which sort of leads into a question that I had, which is sort of more of a future-ish question around, the tools like the information assistant and other LLMs and other machine learning that are always constantly evolving. How do we, what's our thought process at the moment about, well, how do we keep constant? Because, the data we upload into the information assistant today may be superseded by information tomorrow and will likely be the day after. What are our thoughts on looking forward to this system that is ever changing, and how do we continue to get the best out of it?
So one of the things that we put in originally, and again, is fairly primitive, is just those sort of folders and tags as a way to be able to ask questions, say, answer my question, but only using 2021 tax data. There are a number of other parameters you could add to say, using only information published in the last 60 days, using only information published by KJR, using only, and so that ability to start to put on more of those delimiters is one of those ways in which you could say, yes, I know we have 4 variations of the how many days of leave do we have, but I'm only interested in the most recent and understanding the concept of most recent. In addition, just sort of looking forward a little bit, where we're seeing the ask comes up a lot is, right, so I can just throw all my data in there and ask questions. And the answer is, at the moment, right now, it's mostly unstructured information into large language models. A lot of the data you want to be able to ask questions of that your internal data is either in structured data, like a database, or a system of record, right? This is our parts inventory system. And we're not going to load the whole of the parts inventory system into the information assistant. That makes no sense. So part of what we're doing right now is sort of taking you beyond the RAG pattern and introducing the concept of agents and tools. And the concept of agents, tools, and then functions in the next release is going to allow you to not only tap into your internal unstructured data, but then the idea is tap into your structured data, and then most importantly, do something, right? Mm-hmm. Actually, don't just find me the parts, order the part. I want you to communicate with the system of record, having a verbal conversation, and you're going, okay, are you sure you want that part? Yes, order it, please. That's it. And so the idea is that you can now have that conversation-like experience, not just asking questions and getting answers, but asking questions and do something for me. And so that's at least where we're working towards. Step 1, I think we've got RAG well understood. Step 2 is really adding that structured data component and or system of record. And then as part of that step is now execute on it.
Yeah, cool. I agree. The trouble is, context does change. Like the example of new legislation coming out. I chat to folks in defence, and each major upgrade to some warship software comes out with 600 pages of documentation. They've got to try to decipher what elements are sort of important in that. As humans, it's a big challenge for us to deal with that changing context, and it's no different for an IT system. But I think what we are seeing with large language models and generative AI is increased ability to actually measure the performance of that on an ongoing basis. We can build an automation framework that tests and evaluates. When we see new context, we might need to go in and add some human evaluation to sort of look at that and continue to monitor periodically. But we can build up this mechanism to add that to the set of regression suites that we're running, so we can actually measure any change in that system and how it might modify with the new build. And I think the evaluation tools that we're seeing coming out are giving us more power to deal with that. Like, can we put in mechanisms that look at every prompt and things like that, and measure? Maybe we see a change in sort of safety emerging, as perhaps some our agents sort of been directed a bit more to a new group of users that have a different context of use, and maybe that's not quite the prompts we want to accept, or more the responses we want to give. And so ongoing monitoring is I think key, but I think it's through automation that we've got the ability to cope and scale with that, more so than any other human or technical system that we've built before.
Yeah, cool. I've just got another question in from Joe, and I'll kind of read this question back to front a little bit, just because I think it makes more sense there. So, looking at it from a criminal justice point of view, the information assistant is citing everything reasonably transparently and using verified information because we've put it in there, and the answers. So, and Joe's question is, are the answers relatively consistent given that it's a controlled environment? So if we ask the same question twice, will we get roughly the same answer or not?
Well, I'll provide mine, Kelvin. I'm sure I'll have some from the verification side. So as part of our deployments, we do quite a bit of testing. And it is a little bit like Forrest Gump and a box of chocolates. If we ask the same question 10 times in a row, generally we'll get the same key components of the response, but the verbiage will not necessarily be exactly the same. Mm-hmm. The level of detail really has a lot to do with the prompt engineering that we put into it. We've been quite prescriptive, and again, the prompt engineering that we provide is all exposed, so you'll be able to see that as a developer. You can actually just poke your head in there. But we've tried to make it so that it is relatively repeatable, and our focus is accuracy before anything else. And so, if we gave up on functionality, because I wanted more focus on accuracy, that I get a bit more of reliable. So I wouldn't say it's 100%. I would say that when we tested it for ourselves, and that was testing everything from the window size and all of the different, how do I index, how do I translate it, had a significant impact on accuracy. If we started in language A, asked questions in language A, and answered them in A, why are you translating to English in the middle? It actually impacted accuracy. So these are just some of the pieces, but generally we're finding that if we can provide it a grounded response that you can check the citation, you can begin to get a level of trust, but would never consider it to be trustworthy. It's something that allows you to go, well, as one person, it's as if I've read 10,000 pages and I can now go through it 100 times faster, but it's still worth checking. So I'm not sure that's a perfect answer, but that is, at least from an accuracy perspective, where we feel comfortable with it. As long as I can always check it, I'm going, yeah, and the last 9 times it was right, it's probably pretty good, as long as, again, grounding itself and not hallucinating, which is actually quite difficult to prevent these from kind of going off on their own. Kelvin, any comments on that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree, David. I mean, there's just so many variables that generate a response that having control over all of those is next to impossible. But as you pointed out, is it's about getting consistency, and that's even the choice of evaluators and that's why we find things like exact matches and so on don't work. It's we really need to use other tools that look for similarity of the response to the context we're expecting, what other sort of scores or ranks that we have on other evaluation criteria that we've set for it. Because if we're expecting a specific response, then really our evaluation methodology won't deal with the slight variations that the system will produce.
Yeah, and I could certainly see use cases. Hey, I hear somebody screaming. Can I kick down the door? Right? And you don't have all of all of the legal precedents to it. Is it better than not having it at all? And at the very least, look, I did because, and I got these citations that at least this was the reasoning that I had, as opposed to, I think I was, so I did, right? So again, is it a potential step wide of improvement over not remembering every potential law, it's probably an improvement over not having it at all.
That's something I come back to in all these examples, is perfection's the enemy of the good. And oftentimes when we've evaluated machine learning models, we get a bit perplexed when we see a particular result. Oh, that's not that great. But then when we compare it to human performance, we find it's quite a large uplift in capability. So, you need to sort of evaluate these systems in context of what system are we comparing it to. And if we're just dealing with lawyers sort of scanning documents and finding things, their sort of error rate is not that great, So, if we're expecting 100% accuracy on some of the improvements in automation, we're actually setting the bar, beyond where we should do. And again, that perfection's the enemy of the good. We can get a big uplift in safety of the system, improvement of the system, and so on by putting more of these controls in place. But if we set an absolute perfection goal, we actually stuck with a system that is actually suboptimal.
Very cool. Well, we're just about out of time, and we're just about out of questions. So that's probably a good point to start to wrap it up. I really enjoyed the conversation and the points that you both brought. And it's definitely a challenging space in this ever moving and ever evolving field. But I think that every time we look at an application or an application of a solution like this, and if we're starting to think about, well, where is the trust and the accuracy, if we have those two things front of mind, then that's definitely going to stand us in good stead. I just want to, so a couple of next steps. So I'll collate the GitHub link from Dave, and also a couple of links on our KJR side, and I'll send them out to everyone who's joined in. So just wanted to say a big thanks for Dave for joining us in your evening. It's really appreciate you coming in from the other side of the world, and thanks to Kelvin for popping in from Queensland, which is not quite the other side of the world, but it feels like it's a little bit north. So that's it's great. It's been a good conversation, and thanks everyone for coming along. We'll send out the notification when the recording's available. And if you've got any other questions, I'll pop all of our details in that follow-up email, and we'll go from there. So that's us just about on time. And thanks very much for coming along. We'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Drew.